So in terms of Thanks, Claire. So what we'll be covering today is what we mean by monitoring and evaluation. So a sort of more general introduction to monitoring and evaluation, a bit of jargon busting, because as with all of this, there's lots of jargon. And for those of you, again, who are new to this, who haven't done this before, that might be quite a useful little sort of slide to work out what means what. Some ideas for monitoring and evaluation, and we are also really interested in your ideas as well. So some of you who have maybe done this before might have really good ideas. So please do pop those in the chat box as well, or feel free to share them after the presentation. And then we'll talk specifically about reporting back on your Celebrating Communities project. So as I mentioned at the start of this, Birmingham City Council and DSU have really tried to make the project reporting really light touch, so they're not asking for loads of information. So please, don't be intimidated by it, I guess is the message that we want to share with you today. So what do we mean by monitoring and evaluation? So monitoring is about collecting and recording information about your project activities. And evaluation is really about sort of stepping back to understand whether your project achieved what you initially set out to do. Now, the key thing about evaluation, and of course you don't necessarily have to do any evaluation for the Celebrating Communities grant, but it's really about trying to learn from your project. So, what things went well, what didn't go as well. So do bear that in mind. It's not all about how good your project was, but sometimes the most useful thing is really what you learned from it. So why do you need to monitor and evaluate your work? The primary reason often is to keep your funders happy. And it isn't just because funders sit there and think of new cruel and unusual punishments to sort of keep you all on your toes. It's often because they want to talk about the impact that they've had through their investment in these community projects. So yeah, often it's about trying to chunk up all of the different outcomes and outputs of your project. But again, for those of you who have done this before, you will know that monitoring and evaluating your work helps you plan your next project. So for those of you who have got the bug and want to continue doing this, it will help you think about designing your next project. What do you really need to think about to make your next project even better than the activities you'll be running in the next month or so. It helps you to apply for funding in the future, so it starts to build a track record for you. So, the things that you did really well, that you were able to hold this, community festival in your local area. And of course, it helps you to promote your organisation. So for those of you, who are looking for new members or new people to join your activities, this is a great way to share and celebrate all of the good work that you do. So I mentioned some jargon, and of course I just used some jargon, so sorry about that, folks. So monitoring and evaluation does have some sort of jargon included into it. So we just wanted to run through the sort of main terms that you're likely to come across and what they mean. So I'll start with the aim. And of course, you might have been asked about this in your application form. So what's a longer term change that you want to make? So that overarching, the big change that you want to see. Often they're hard to quantify in a short space of time. It might be a big, a sort of a big aim that you have to improve the local area. So that might not happen sort of within a few months, or it might not happen over a period of a few weeks, but it might be a longer term process, a longer term change that you see in your local area. So that's your aim. Often overarching, as I said, the sort of longer term change you want to see happen. So your inputs, if people still use that term, are the key resources you need to support the project. So they can include funding, volunteers, they might include equipment, it might be input from other partner organisations. So it's all of those things that really help you to get your project going. Activities, it's pretty straightforward. These are the project activities. So these are the things you will do to help your project achieve that longer term aim that you're hoping to sort of see, that longer term change. And your outputs are often the direct results of your activities. So once you've carried something out, so in this example, we've used sort of young people accessing green spaces. So once you've cleared the space, once you've put in equipment, your outputs are sort of often a result of your activities. So you might have had 10 volunteers that joined the activity. And this, you might want to sort of measure the number of young people who have used that space as a result of you clearing that space, a result of your project activities. So outputs are often recorded in numbers, so they're more easily quantifiable. You can sort of count the things that happen as a result of your activities. And of course, these should lead to your outcomes. And your outcomes are the changes that happen because of your project. So again, if we sort of follow the logic of this example, you know, outcome might be an improved local space. More young people are aware of that local green space and are happy to use it now that it's cleared and has some good equipment in there as well. Outcomes are often, when we talk about outcomes, we tend to use language like improved or increased, decreased. So it's less about the numbers and more about the changes that have happened as a result of your project. And again, these should lead to that longer term aim. So think about that longer term change that you want to happen as a result of the activity that you're doing. So hopefully this is a helpful way to sort of visualize all of those different component parts of your monitoring and evaluation. So obviously your inputs, the things that you need to run your activity, contribute to your activity. Your activity then results in outputs. They result in sort of numbers or people accessing the space, or, you know, numbers of people participating in your project. And then your output, so all of these numbers contribute to your outcomes. So, you know, the increase in physical activity, the improved local space, and a culmination. So the combination of all of these different component parts contributes to that aim, to that longer term change. So the improved local area as a result of, you know, young people using the space, volunteers engaging in your community activity. So hopefully that's a helpful way to describe and to sort of break down all of these component parts of your monitoring and evaluation. So the really key thing is about how to start your monitoring. And I'm going to focus mostly on monitoring because, as I said, this Celebrating Communities is less about evaluating your work, but trying to record what happened as a result of your activities. So once you've decided what will happen as a result of your project, so think about the activities that will happen, the outputs, so think about the numbers of people you're hoping to join in your activities, and your outcomes, so those sort of medium-term changes, so, you know, improved local space, increased connectivity between local people. You'll need to think about how to measure the results. So as I said, you've got all your component parts. Sort of what sits alongside that really is often how to measure the results. And we've got some examples that we can share with you. And as I said, you might have some great examples. So please do pop those in the chat, because I think it's always interesting to hear from sort of community groups in terms of how they measure their activities and the changes that they've made. So I always say, choose simple ways of measuring that match the time and resources that you have. So, you know, if you're doing a bigger project over sort of 12 months, then you might want to invest a little bit more in your sort of how you measure, so monitoring and evaluation. But generally, I think with most of the Celebrating Communities project, they're short, they're small projects. You haven't been given loads of funding to carry out your activity. So just please do think about measuring things that are relatively easy to measure and that sort of match the time and the resources that you have. As I said, NDSU have been really clear that they're trying to keep this as light touch as they can. Of course, it's public money, so they want to make sure that there are good results happening, but they recognise that all of the projects that have been chosen and have been invested in, you know, carry out good work. So have a think about ways in which you can measure that match the time and the resources that you have on this. And of course, depending on your project, you might want to start measuring from the start of your project or at the end of each different activity. So for those of you who are running maybe project activities over a period of time, so you might be doing, 6 cricket training sessions, for example, you might want to measure sort of people's confidence at the start, and then people's confidence or knowledge of the rules of cricket at the end of the project. So do have a think about that. And of course, again, if you're thinking about how you might want to measure that, feel free to ask us or pop any questions into the chat as well. So we thought it'd be helpful to share some examples of how you might measure different types of activities. Of course, this is a specific activity. It's an example of what some people might be doing, but hopefully you can see sort of the measurement can be applied to lots of different types of activities. So this one, again, is an example of an aim, which is about improving young people's health and well-being. And one of the sort of smaller aims, the activity is really about enabling young people to access green spaces in their local area. So an example of what to measure is how many young people currently use spaces, access green spaces in their local area. And of course, how to measure that might be about counting the numbers of people that have used the site, or just asking people if they use current green spaces in their local area. In terms of improving local green spaces, which will be one of the project activities, you might want to, have a little think about currently how are they accessible, and then once you have improved that, you might want to think about how have they been improved. And again, in terms of how to measure that, you might want to think about the numbers of people using the site. Of course, the really easy way is just to ask people, can you use the site? How easy do you find using this local green space? Did you use it before? Those sorts of questions that you might want to ask sort of people. One of your project activities, as contributing to this overarching aim of enabling young people to access green spaces, might be about clearing the space to be used. So you might want to, in terms of what you measure, that will be about what the space was like before and after as a result of your sort of project activities. And how to measure. So photographs are always great because you can then physically see the difference that has been made. And I always, I think especially with local projects, it's really important to talk to local people, interviews with people helping to clear the space or the users of the space. So if you imagine you've got, 10 volunteers that are helping you to clear the space, you might want to just ask them, what was the space like before? How do you think this will help local people access the new green space in the area? And again, thinking about equipment, for those of you who have got sort of a project activity around improving equipment or introducing new equipment, you might want to sort of, thinking about what the measurement is really about that new equipment. And again, photographs are great because if it's a new piece of equipment, something that's capital, you might, photographs are a great way to demonstrate the value of that new equipment being in place. And again, asking people, whether they will use the equipment, how have they used it, would they have used the space before, what value does the new equipment bring to this new green space? So, as I said, it's really, I think for most of the Celebrating Communities projects, photographs are great, sort of asking people really simple, straightforward, short questionnaires, I think often help. So we talked about the sort of celebrating communities and reporting on the project. I will share the actual form with you in a second, so you'll get to see that. But on the form, you will be asked to report on so the number of people who joined in your activities. So sometimes the people are referred to as sort of the beneficiaries of your activity, your expenditure and any changes you've made to the budget. So again, there's a recognition that, with sort of project activity, things don't always go to plan. And again, one example that we've used a lot of is the Great British Summer. So whilst it's very beautiful for the next couple of days, actually at the time of your activity, there might be a planned downpour, there might be a massive downpour, so you might need to go and get a gazebo or some sort of covering. So if that does happen, I think NDSU recognise that you have to respond to those sort of situations. So there's no, if there's an emergency or you need to shift sort of the budget around, that's okay, but please do make a note of any changes you've made to your budget. So outcomes, we talked about those changes that happened as a result of your project activity, and refer back to what you wrote in your original application form. So you would have been asked about, what will happen as a result of your activity? Will you get an increased number of people sort of accessing your activities, or increased number of people interested in cricket as a result of the work you've done? So refer back to your original application form and try and have a think about how you might measure those outcomes, so you can report back in your final monitoring and evaluation report. You will be asked for a case study. So as I said further down the presentation, I've put in some just very short questions to help you put a case study together. It doesn't have to be massive. It can be a really short paragraph. As a result of your activity or your project, it's really nice to be able to describe, what impact that made on one of the local people or local people accessing that project. So have a think about how you might capture that information from someone. It might be that you're doing a day event, and if that's the case, it might be on the day, asking someone for those activities. But as I said, if you're doing a number of activities over a period of time, it might be nice to be able to measure the impact that your work is having on their health and well-being. And then, of course, you'll be asked for any other relevant information. So we talked about learning. So, what did you learn? Is it great to have a community activity on a weekend? Those sorts of things. Is there anything unexpected that happened, either good or bad? It certainly won't be penalised for it, but it's really helpful to learn sort of what happened as a result. Anything that was unexpected that you weren't anticipating. Those are often really interesting for sort of funders to read and for you to learn from, of course. So any plans for the project going forward? As a result, we've had 20 people want to sign up for cricket. That's fantastic. So, maybe there's a local cricket club that's going to start as a result of your activity, or any new partnerships formed. So, as a result of doing our work, we worked with a local cricket coach, for example. And so things like that, I think NDSU are really interested in capturing as well. Just as an aside, so you might have heard about the Impact app, which is an application that's used to demonstrate kind of the social impact of the work that you do. And as part of this project, some groups will be asked to complete their monitoring via the Impact app. And if you have been contacted and you have been asked to use the Impact app, you don't need to complete a separate monitoring form. So all your monitoring will be done via that Impact app. If you do need to use the app, you will be contacted by Nick Booth from Podnosh. So hopefully those groups that are expected to use the Impact app have been contacted already. So if you're on the call and you have been contacted by Nick, then you don't need to do the monitoring and evaluation form. You'll be doing your monitoring via this Impact app. But of course, if you haven't been contacted, then you will need to do this monitoring and evaluation form, which I will share with you now. And sorry, that's probably not very clear on the presentation. So, but it just gives you an idea of what you'll be asked for. And I know Carla and colleagues at NDSU, as I said, have really tried to keep this kind of light touch. So the first section is very much about the activity and sort of the numbers of people that attended each activity. So, you know, if you need to insert more rows, you can do. So if you've run, you know, 6 or 7 parts, 6 or 7 activities as a result of your project, you can include them in there. And again, your expenditures we talked about. So, you know, think about what you applied for originally. So are there any changes in that? Please do add that in to that sort of third box below. The outcomes, so refer back to those very, very first briefing sessions. Many of you attended those. So we talked about, you know, how it contributed to the outcomes for the Commonwealth Games. And again, think about what you applied for in your original application form, so you can use those outcomes and then just report back on those. Now, sometimes, you know, you won't always make the change that you originally envisaged. That's absolutely fine. Just do pop that in there and then maybe talk about things that happened either as a result of or where, you know, new outcomes that you didn't anticipate actually happening through your project. And then finally, the case study, as I mentioned, so I'll on the next slide is a list of case study questions that you can use. You might have examples that you use anyway, but these I think are quite useful and pretty straightforward to put your case study together. And as I said, any other relevant information, so partnerships, new learning and future plans for the project. I think these are meant to be quite short and sweet, so please don't spend days and days and days on these monitoring forms. I'm sure Carla will agree with me that it's quite okay to just sort of fill in what's appropriate. So I mentioned the case study questions. So these are sort of examples that I've put together, which you might want to use. If anyone is really interested in very comprehensive case studies and case study questions, do get in touch and I can send you something that's a bit more complex. But certainly for celebrating communities, you don't need to, you know, write up complex and long sort of case studies really. So just asking questions about how you heard about the organisation or the activity, what you enjoyed most. That's always a nice thing to hear. If you've done something like this before, so that's always a good way to sort of gauge whether this is like someone who's new to this. Always a really, really great sign if they've enjoyed the activity and they're new to it. And then of course, how it's helped you, that person sort of participating in the activity, or maybe other people. So, you know, as a volunteer, clearing a space, sometimes that can really help you. Obviously it gets you physically active, but it helps you to meet new people. But of course, there is the wider impact on the local community as well, of course, about clearing the space. And I think a really great question is always about whether they'd do something like this again, or whether this has helped them, you know, sort of engage in their local community and whether they're really interested in doing more community activities. So again, a really good sign of whether you've been able to kind of spark sort of a bit of enthusiasm in local people for that. And then finally, just in terms of dates, so Carla, do you mind running through the dates, just so that we've got a really clear message?
Yeah, so we understand that we've got a number of projects that have been funded for one-off events, some are short-term, and then we've got some that are a bit more long-term. So we're aiming for the majority of activity to take place before the end of August, but we are aware that some projects will be going past that date. So for that reason, what we have said is that if your project is going to take place after the end of August, we'd ask you to send us a progress update on the activity that you have done by Wednesday, the 31st of August at the latest. If your activity will be completed by the end of August, what we're saying to you is send the monitoring report back to us as soon as it finishes, and you've got time to pull that together, because I know how hard it is when you step away from the project and then have to come back to it a month later to fill in the monitoring report. So the deadline for that is when your project finishes, or it will be Wednesday the 14th of September. Please send your completed grant monitoring form to the NDSU mailbox, and then it will be the whole of the team that will be reading them based on the patches that we cover. I will be sending out more information, which will include the dates and a copy of the form later this week. And if you do have any questions, then feel free to just come back to us.
Great. Thanks, Carla. Hopefully that was clear to people. And yeah, for those of you who, as I said, have got the bug and are thinking about your next project and sort of the next thing that you want to do in your local community, I've put together a set of useful resources just around sort of getting started on impact and evaluation and maybe impact measurement. So, but again, if you're interested in that, please do get in touch with us. We can sort of point you in the right direction. But for the purposes of your Celebrating Communities grant, you don't necessarily need all of that information. You know, please do just have a look at the monitoring form and have a think about those really sort of straightforward project activities and the outcomes and the outputs that will happen as a result of your project. So I think that's enough from me. I was going to say, you've all heard enough from me. We were going to try and change a presenter because I think lots of people have just seen and heard from me the whole way through this project. So do people have any questions? And we need to get back to work.